Christ. Well, let me ask you a quick question. How many of you sometimes have discovered as you've gotten older, you become more and more forgetful? Anybody? Wow, that is probably the quickest I've seen hands ever go up in this place. Like, yeah. What was the question? I know. Why is my hand up in the air? I don't know. Did I just volunteer for something or vote on something? I'm not sure. Yeah, sometimes, and I'm not even that old. I think I'm 42. I'm not sure. And I find myself forgetting stuff. And it's terrible. It's one of those horrible things in life. The other day, I found myself putting some potato chips in the fridge. And I'm like, what am I doing? I don't think these go in here. Who knows? What's my sock doing in here? I'm not sure why that's in here either. Sometimes you just forget things and it becomes troublesome. Then there's the losing of the car keys and losing of the wallets and all of those things, and your cell phone and the TV remote. In fact, for Christmas, I got this little device called the Tile. Anybody heard of the Tile? This is an advertisement for the Tile, apparently. And it's this little flat thing that you can hang on your keys, or you can put it in your pocket. Well, that's not going to help you unless you lose your pocket. But if you forget things, like I've got one in my wallet, and it connects to my cell phone, so not like with a string, but so if I can't find my wallet, I can look on my cell phone and I can dial, I can push the little button and my wallet will start ringing, so I can find my wallet, which is cool. Or there's even a little GPS, so you can see, oh, it's in Manhattan right now. Why is my wallet in Manhattan right now? That's not good. So that's a pretty cool little thing. So you can, except for I sit on my wallet sometimes, and then my phone starts ringing anyway. So anyway, it's one of those helpful things for us that forget things. I can't figure out where I left that thing. So it's hard to remember stuff. So we're going to talk about some things that we should remember today. And in fact, what are some things, as you think about things that you should always remember, what are a few things that you should always remember? Just top of your head, what are they? Anniversaries. How many of you think that should go towards the top of the list? That's right. Those same hands. Right. What else?
Birthdays.
Did you say wife's name? Birthday. And her name. And her
Children.
Sorry, Jeff. Didn't mean to get you in trouble there. That's Lynn, right? What else?
Your children.
Your children. That was one of my kids. It doesn't count. All right. What else do we remember? Clean underpants when we were going on vacation. That was my wife, by the way. Yes. I forgot my deodorant and my toothbrush this last vacation, which was just like a week ago. I'm like, oh man. We found some more stuff, okay? It wasn't like a week of it. Fortunately, it's not hot in North Carolina. Okay, what else? What are some other things that you should remember? Locker combinations, absolutely. You think of questions as passwords. Passwords are the worst. Can't stand those things. And you have to change them every once in a while. You should remember these things. And birthdays. Anybody remember when you had to remember a telephone number? I mean, we struggle with 4 digits now. I'm like, I can't remember my PIN number. We used to have to remember telephone numbers. And now you just you don't even have to punch it in. You just tell your phone to call that person. And it's a pretty awesome thing. Because we forget things. But here's the deal. We're supposed to remember some important things in our lives, right? There are things in our lives, like our anniversaries and the birth of a child, at least the first couple. You remember those things, right? And the reason why we remember those things is because they're important. They're significant things that happen in our lives. And so we remember those things. Sometimes there's even things that we remember that kind of make us sad. Even good things. Because we look back and we reminisce about the good old days. Right? And Facebook has this crazy thing, and it says, hey, this is a memory from 7 years ago. And you're like, oh, that's discouraging. Remember? You look at the Facebook post, you're like, oh, the kids were so cute then. Now look at them. Right? Or you look at the Facebook post and you're like, look how thin I was. And look how much hair I had. And now my hair is thin, but my body isn't, right? And you reminisce about the good old days. Sometimes you have those happy thoughts of those memories long ago. Well, today we're going to look at a psalm where the writer looks back and he remembers some things in life. In fact, he actually remembers some good times. He remembers some good things that happened in his life. He remembers the goodness of God, and he compares some of those good memories with his current situation. And it brings up some discontent feelings, and it saddens him deeply. In fact, he's flat out depressed. So we're going to look at Psalm 77 today. I apologize, I don't know what page number it is in our Bibles, but Psalm 77, you can find it in our Bibles. There's a table of contents, you can look it up. If you don't have a Bible, feel free to take that one home with you. We would love for you to have that. But we're going to look at Psalm 77. Interesting fun fact for you. My bus number was 77. I remember that. I was just a little kid. The first bus I ever rode on was 77. So this is one of those things as a kid, your parents are like, remember what bus to get on. It's 77, right? Okay, so Psalm 77 was written by Asaph. And now, like Brody mentioned a couple weeks ago, Asaph was a Levite, so he was a priest, he was a musician. He was a man that was very close to the heart of God. In this psalm that we're going to look at, Psalm 77, like many of the other psalms that are in the Psalms, there's kind of like a side A and a side B. There's a side A is kind of a desperation, and then it goes to deliverance, where it starts out desperation, where things aren't going well, or the memories aren't going good, and then there is a flip side to that. There is the songs of deliverance, like the first psalm that we looked at, side A and side B, where it goes from desperation to deliverance. In the first half of the psalm, Asaph, he paints this very dark picture of pain and discouragement, and he's crying out in the middle of the night in what appears to be a very dark moment in his life. So let's read this. Psalm 77, beginning of verse 1, he says this. He says, I cried out to God for help. I cried out to God to hear me. When I was in distress, I sought the Lord. At night, I stretched out untiring hands. Now, pause real quick. Those all sound like great things, right? When you're discouraged, you cry out to God, and you pray, and you ask, God, would you have mercy? God, would you deliver me? Those are all great things. And he's taking his struggle to God. But the verse ends this way, and it says, and I would not be comforted. So he's praying to God, and he's desperate, and yet still, at the end of the night, he's not comforted. Does that ever happen to you? Yeah. That happens to us. God, what is going on here? God, what are you doing? And we cry out to God, and we still don't have any answers at the end of the day. God, what is going on here? You ever find yourself in a season where all you can see in front of you is darkness? And things just don't seem to get better. It's not like a sitcom where you watch it and 20 minutes later the conflict is resolved. Life's not always like that. Prayer is not always like that. Sometimes you go through these moments, these seasons where no matter what you do, there is just no comfort. And that's the season that Asaph is in. And even though you're doing the right things, you're going to God, the situation still seems overwhelming. And all you can focus on is what is right in front of you. Maybe it's a bill that you can't afford to pay. Or it's the doctor's prognosis. And that's all you can think about. Maybe it's those angry words that were spoken to you, and you just keep replaying that over and over again. Maybe it's the angry words that you spoke to somebody else. And that's all you can think about. Maybe it's your job situation, or your housing situation, or it's the death of a loved one, or it's something else. You know what those things are. And that's all that you can kind of focus on in that moment. Asaph is here, and he's super discouraged. He's crying out to God, but there seems to be no comfort, even in crying out to God. In fact, look at what Asaph says next in verse 3. He says, I remembered you, God, and I groaned. That's not a good thing, right? I remembered you, God, and I groaned. I meditated, and my spirit grew faint. So here he is. He is overwhelmed by his situation. Then he says, you kept my eyes from closing. I was too troubled to speak. So here he is. He's unable to sleep at night. You've been there. You have these thoughts racing through your minds, unable to sleep. He's distressed. He's so distressed he can't even talk about it. You ever been there? It's like, I just don't want to talk about it. I don't even want to talk about it. That's Asaph in this moment. He's discouraged. He's distressed. He's overwhelmed. He's disturbed. So why is he so disturbed? According to verse 5, is because he's thinking about the past and he's comparing it to his current situation. Verse 5, he says, I thought about my former days, the years of long ago. So here he is. He's thinking about the good old days, right? Times when he sang out in joy. Times when things were going great instead of him crying out in anguish at night. And now he's disturbed because of his present circumstances. And his present circumstances are in sharp contrast with the way things are going in his life right now. And he remembers what things were like before. And now they're not so great. Verse 6, he elaborates a little bit further. He says, I remembered, so he's remembering these things. I remembered my songs in the night. Not his crying out, but his songs in the night when things were good. I remembered my songs in the night. My heart meditated and my spirit asked, will the Lord reject me forever? Will he never show his favor again? Has his unfailing love vanished forever? Now think about that. Just that phrase. It's kind of like an oxymoron, right? He's saying, your unfailing love, is it gone now? I mean, he is just so discouraged, in trouble. Has his unfailing love vanished forever? Has his promise failed for all time? Has God forgotten to be merciful? Has he in his anger withheld his compassion? How many of you think Asaph's having a bad day? I mean, this does not sound very good. He's so incredibly discouraged and depressed. And we've been there. And all we can focus on is what is right in front of us. Asaph, he's torn and he's conflicted because he feels abandoned by God in this moment. He's thinking that his best days are all behind him. He feels rejected by God, and it sounds as if he's beginning to doubt God's faithfulness. And if we're not careful, I believe that can happen to each of us as well. These Psalms are so relatable. See, we can get so focused on our circumstances that we forget God's faithfulness. If you're taking notes, here's side A. Side A is this. Our current reality can sometimes cloud our memory. Our current reality can sometimes cloud our memory. That happens to us. We get so focused on the things that are going on in our lives right now that we forget that God has been faithful through all of it. Through all of it, it doesn't matter what we've gone through, God has been faithful. And sometimes we look around at the difficulties in life, and sometimes that's all we can see. We see our problems. We see our struggles. We see the things that we don't have. Well, I wish I had that. I wish I could have this. I remember when I had more of this, but now I don't have any of that. We see those things. We see our bills. We see our hurts. We see our pains. We see the things that are broken that need to be fixed. Let me ask, have you ever walked into your house and you get so fixated on one thing that is broken in your house? Does that ever happen to you? You get in there and you're just, I'm the only one. You walk in there, it's like, man, there's that broken tile right in front of the fridge. And there's that broken tile. Every time you step on it, it goes ding, and you're like, oh, it's not fastened to the floor. That's why it makes that noise. Somebody got to do something about that. And then the next day comes around and like, there's that broken tile again. And you get so fixated on that one thing that is broken that listen, this happens. We get so fixated on the one thing that is broken in our houses that we forget that we get the privilege of living indoors. We get to live in a house. We get to live in a place where we're protected from the elements. Yet we're so fixated on that one thing. Some of you guys, you're elbowing your wife right now. You're like, see, I don't have to do the stuff on the list. PD doesn't do it. That's not where I'm going with this. My point is sometimes we get so fixated on the wrong things that our current reality can cloud our memory. We have been so blessed by God's great faithfulness. So here Asaph is, and he's looking at his current reality. So how does he get out of this discouragement? How does he find hope for the future? Well, he flips the tape over. And he begins to listen to the other side of this mixtape that he has. And he digs deeper into the past. I love this. You see this. Here's a great turning point. Verse 10. Verse 10, he says, then. See, that's a turning point in there. Right? There's a contrasting word there. He says, then I thought, to this I will appeal. The years when the Most High stretched out his right hand. I love that. Because when you're looking at this text, you remember there was another time where he talked about stretching out his hands. Remember when Asaph was like, man, I stretched out my hands and I wasn't comforted? Here he's saying, listen, I'm going to look back and I'm going to look at when God stretched out his hands, what took place. You see the difference there? See, when we stretch out our hands and when we try to fix things on our own strength and when we flex our flabby little muscles, nothing seems to happen. But when God flexes his muscles and he stretches out his hands, incredible things happen. And so he says, listen, I'm going to make this appeal. I'm going to think back to the years when the Most High stretched out his right hand, when he flexed his muscles. In verse 11 it says, and I will remember. There's that word remember again. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your miracles of long ago. I love that phrase where it says, of long ago. You know what he's saying there? He's saying, I'm not thinking about just this week. I'm not just thinking about last week or last month or last year. I'm thinking big picture, not just my current reality, but big picture. Your miracles of long ago, your faithfulness. And then he says in verse 12, he says, I will consider all your works. Not just the things that are happening to me recently, but all of them. You want to remember something? Don't just think about this last week. Think about your lifetime and how God has blessed you so much. I will remember all your works, and I will meditate on all your mighty deeds, not just my current reality. Then verse 13, he says, your ways, God, are holy. You know what he's saying there? God, your ways, the path that you choose is holy. It is perfect. It is set apart. That's what the word literally means, holy. Set apart. It's pure. It is completely different than our ways oftentimes. Then he says, what God is as great as our God? What little g God is as great as our God? We sing songs that remind us that no one is as great as our God. And then verse 14 says, you are the God who performs miracles. You display your power among the peoples. With your mighty arm, you redeemed your people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph. Now he's going to get back a little bit further in history. He's not just looking at his current reality. He's looking back further. In fact, he uses these two patriarchs. He talks about Jacob and Joseph. Now, oftentimes when we read in Scripture, it talks about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? Here he goes to Jacob and Joseph, and I think he does it for a reason. He wants us to focus a little bit more on Joseph rather than Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He says Jacob and Joseph. Now, when we think about Joseph, we think about the times when they were in Egypt, right? They're in Egypt, and God had sent Joseph on ahead of the rest of the people to deliver his people from the severe famine that was going on. And God actually used Joseph and his family to build this mighty nation when they were in Egypt. And then all of a sudden something happened. After things were going good for a while, the Israelites were put into bondage. They were put into slavery. And they were in slavery for like 400 years. Not good times for them. So when he talks about Jacob and Joseph, we automatically go back to Egypt. When they were in slavery, when they were in bondage. And Asaph, in this psalm, he's going to talk about crossing the Red Sea. When God splits the seas and they walk across on dry ground. That's why we sing that song, No Longer Slaves, that God has split the seas and that we go right through the middle. And so he goes back to that moment, the crossing of the Red Sea. Check this out. It's such beautiful words that he uses here. Verse 16, it says, the water saw you, God. The water saw you and withered. That is so amazing. You know, if you didn't know, I was away this last week. One of the places we went on our vacations, we went to Myrtle Beach for like 3 days. And I got to spend some time boarding out there in the waves, and some of those waves were pretty big. They were over my head. Now, when the waves saw me, they weren't like, whoa, 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 we need to calm down a little bit because Petey is in the water right now. We are afraid. I did not wither any waves, okay? In case you're wondering. The waves withered me a few times, right? They just kept right on going. They didn't care about me at all. They just kept going. Blasted right past me and through me at times, and over me. We're here, he says, the water saw you, God. The water saw you and withered. The very depths were convulsed. The clouds poured down water, and the heavens resounded with thunder. Your arrows flashed back and forth. We're talking about this lightning. It says your thunder was heard in the whirlwind. Your lightning lit up the world, and the earth trembled and quaked. Can you imagine this moment where God splits the seas and they walk across on dry ground? I mean, we get this privilege of seeing thunderstorms and lightning storms, right? In fact, as I was preparing this several different times, as I was preparing this message, you know, there were thunderstorms that were going on. And so it's just a perfect object lesson of God's strength and His power. It's uncontrollable. We can't do anything about it. And yet God is just so powerful. And He paints this picture of this massive thunderstorm that takes place, and He just splits the sea. Verse 19, it says, I love this. He goes, your path led through the sea. Now just pause real quick. It says through the sea, not just around it. See, sometimes we want God to move us around the obstacles in life. But oftentimes, I think God wants to take us right through the middle. And He takes them right through the middle of the sea. You know what? Sometimes that's the only route that God is willing to use. And so He takes them right through the sea, not around them, but right through it. And then He says, your way through the mighty waters, though your footprints were not seen. I get goosebumps thinking about that. Though your footprints were not seen. So God led them, even when they couldn't physically see and walking, they knew it was God leading. You know, sometimes that happens in our lives too, doesn't it? We're like, God, I'm not sure which way to go, and then all of a sudden, I think I'm supposed to go this way. You don't see the footprints, you don't see the hand of God necessarily physically, but you know it's what God wants for you. God does that for us. Even though we can't see His footprints. And let's face it, oftentimes we do not see the footprints of God, and yet He still leads us. In fact, Romans 11 tells us that God's ways are unsearchable and His paths beyond tracing out. And just because you can't see God working doesn't mean that God isn't working. Sometimes His footprints are just unseen. And then in verse 20 he says this. He says, you led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. So He used these men of God to deliver them from slavery and bondage out of Egypt to the place that God ultimately wanted to take them, to the promised land. That's what God does. And so do you see what's going on here? Asaph, he's thinking about his recent past. He's thinking about some of the things that have happened in his lifetime. And he's remembering some of the good old days, but you know, he's going through a difficult season of life. And so he says, listen, I've got to get back further. I've got to look beyond my own lifetime. It's a beautiful psalm. There's this incredible turnaround for him. And he goes from this distress to deliverance because he remembered God's past faithfulness. See, side A is this, our current reality can cloud our memory. Here's side B. God's past faithfulness trumps our current reality. God's past faithfulness trumps our current reality. See, in remembering God's past faithfulness, I believe, is the key to our future hope. When things seem hopeless and when things don't seem like they're going well, we need to sometimes look back at those Red Sea moments where God splits the sea and we walk across on dry ground. And let's face it, there are some times where we see God do some amazing things in our lives, where you see God just do something that, man, I could have never imagined that God would have done this. Listen, when you come across those moments where you see God do something in your life, remember those things. You might need to write them down. Remember them, because you may need to come back to that moment to be reminded of God's great faithfulness. Man, it doesn't seem like it's going well right now, but I remember when God worked things out. His footprints were unseen, but I remember that God did something amazing, even though I couldn't see what he was doing at the time. We can go back to those moments, those Red Sea moments, and remember how God delivered us. And for Asaph, he had to go back further in history, and he got beyond his own experience even. This was before his time. When he was talking about the Red Sea, I'm going to go back long ago. So he goes beyond his own experience, beyond his own story, and he looks at this grander story of what God had been doing. And he remembered how our God is a God of deliverance. That's what he remembered when he thought about the Red Sea. Like Brody said a couple weeks ago, sometimes we need to go from being overwhelmed by our situation to being overwhelmed by our God. See, our current reality, the things that we're struggling with right now, it can cloud our vision, it can cloud our memory. And when that happens, we begin to doubt God's goodness. And like Asaph, we begin to wonder, does God really care? Has God abandoned me? Does God even love me? I hear about his unfailing love, but I'm not feeling it right now. And in those moments, we need to flip the tape over, right? Push the eject button, flip the tape over, and play the other side. We need to be reminded of God's past faithfulness, which trumps our current reality. We need to remember what God has done for us, his faithfulness. And like Asaph, we need to sometimes go back further in history. Perhaps today, that's what we need to do. With whatever you're struggling with whatever that thing is that's keeping you up at night, with whatever that thing is that I just don't want to talk about. Perhaps we need to go back further in history. And we need to remember God's faithfulness. Now for us, we don't go back to the Red Sea. We go back to the cross. That was our place of deliverance. That's why we sing about the cross and we talk about the empty tomb that was borrowed for 3 days. Because that's where our deliverance took place. That's the thing that we are called to remember. See, this passage references this incredible event, the crossing of the Red Sea. And the nation, they frequently went back to that moment, because they remembered this event, because it was a defining moment in their history. The crossing of the Red Sea marked the deliverance of God's people from slavery and from bondage. That's what the cross does for us. In fact, just before they crossed the Red Sea, just before they left Egypt, they ate this meal together. It was called the Passover meal. And it celebrated the fact that God was going to deliver them, and deliver them only. Egypt, they were going to be wiped out. Their firstborn children, they were going to be wiped out. But any house that had the blood of the lamb on the doorpost and on the frame, the angel of God would pass over their house, and they would be rescued and delivered. And so they ate this meal. They sacrificed this lamb. And they poured that blood out on the doorpost. And God passed over them and delivered them. So as they ate that meal, they were reminded of God's protection and his deliverance. And it was a meal that 2,000 years later, Jesus would redefine for us. The Passover meal was redefined. And when Jesus redefined the Passover meal, he essentially said to his followers, listen, instead of remembering the Red Sea, I want you to remember me. Instead of remembering the deliverance from Egypt, I want you to remember the deliverance from your sin. Instead of remembering the Passover lamb, I want you to remember me, who is the lamb that has been sacrificed for you. That's what I want you to remember. In fact, in the moments just prior to his crucifixion, Jesus tells us that he wants us to remember him. In 1 Corinthians 11:23, Jesus says this, the Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And then in verse 25, he says this, in the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. That's what God wants us to remember. He wants us to remember him and his sacrifice for us. At this time, we're going to celebrate communion. I'm going to ask our servers if they would come forward. And as they're doing that, let me read another passage. In 1 Corinthians 11:26, it says, for whenever ye eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes. You proclaim this. In other words, we remember, we give thanksgiving, we celebrate what God has done for us. And then in verse 27, he says this, so then, whoever eats this bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of sinning against the body and blood of the Lord. Therefore, everyone ought to examine themselves before they eat of the bread and cup. So before we begin, let's just take a moment of silence. And I want you to examine your own hearts, examine your life, and confess any known sin that you may have.